live in an age of depression. Almost everyone knows someone who is taking antidepressants. And as a practicing psychiatrist, I regularly prescribe them. But with the increasing use of these drugs, there's been a huge upsurge in the numbers of people who are depressed. This is not what's supposed to happen when treatments work, which suggests to me that the antidepressants are less a solution than part of the problem.
Actually standing in my bathtub with the 38 cocked, ready to. Different other antidepressants like Buspar, which did not work, Trazodone, Vistaril, and Klonopin, and we're going to try you on Paxil. Yeah, go Paxil!
The theme of last year's American Psychiatric Association meeting in New Orleans was Mind Meets Brain. It's where the minds of the 20,000 psychiatrists who attend meet the brains of the pharmaceutical industry.
I'm always interested in what the newest or latest things are. I hear some of the information on it, but...
It's a bit like a trade show. The pharmaceutical companies are amongst the biggest in the world. Here, these global corporations display their new products annually to the dealers, in this case, psychiatrists. And the dealers provide the products, like Prozac or Paxil, to many satisfied customers.
Normally, years ago, if they would have brought me a sandwich and I wasn't content with it, I would have just ate it and wouldn't have said anything. But they brought the sandwich out without my Swiss cheese. And I'm paying for this, so they're going to put my Swiss cheese on it. And I told the lady that was sitting there, who is a psychologist, I said, no, I'm sending this sandwich back. They're going to give me my Swiss cheese. I said, if it wouldn't be for Paxil, I wouldn't be saying that. I would be eating it and swallowing it.
Of the top 10 best-selling drugs in America, 4 are antidepressants. This is a huge business with a potential for even further growth. "50 years ago, depression was mostly confined to mental hospitals where methods were crude by today's standards. Unlike physical illness, where a blood test can often diagnose a disease, there has never been a physiological test for any mental illness. Depression was generally defined as a loss of vitality. Outside hospitals, at least in the USA, the treatment was often psychoanalysis. On the wards, the only effective treatment which is still used today was electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT. The first real breakthrough in the treatment of mental disorders came in 1952 with the discovery of a drug, chlorpromazine, which calmed down schizophrenics. Chlorpromazine was an immediate commercial success, and it generated huge expectations for the treatment of mental illness. Just as the antibiotics worked as magic bullets to wipe out physical illnesses such as tuberculosis, so also the search was now on for drugs to treat mental illness. Magic bullets for the mind. Basel was home to the pharmaceutical company Geigy.
I came to Geigy first in 1949. I came as a young scientist. My job was to develop new drugs for the treatment of a variety of illnesses. Chlorpromazine came on stream was developed by Roan Poulenc in France, and eventually it virtually emptied the hospitals of long-stay patients with schizophrenia. Well, of course, this was very exciting for people in the drug industry. We wanted to follow this up, and so we decided to look for substances which might have a similar action. And in the basement of our building here, there is or was a warehouse-stroke-museum where medicines, drugs of many kinds discovered over the very long period of Geiger's existence were just stored. And we went down there and we found a compound which had been developed in 1898. And we suddenly realized it had the right kind of ring structure so that it might conceivably have the same effect as torpromazine.
Alan Broadhurst took the new drug, now called imipramine, to be tested on 300 patients at the nearby Munsterlingen Hospital. The test will be conducted by Dr. Roland Kuhn.
We came with great expectations. We assumed that because of its similarity to torpromazine, which was known to be very potent antischizophrenic, that imipramine would probably work in the same way. And of course, the drug was given to schizophrenic patients, and it was fairly disastrous, the result.
After taking the drug, many of the patients became wildly agitated. The test was discontinued. But while it was obviously unsuited to schizophrenics, imipramine clearly had a powerful effect. Geigy decided to start a new trial, this time to see if the drug could be used to rouse depressed patients.
I still remember coming here on the day when we put it to him. Firstly, I was not sure that he would agree at all. But secondly, in my heart of hearts, I realized that it may well be that it would not exert any antidepressant effect, and for all I knew it might produce, again, very uncomfortable results in some or all of the patients.
The whole hospital had 700 patients, and in this room there are 20 beds, and the patients have been observed during 24 hours. During the time of the development of the new medicament, I went in the morning after the sleep, I went before dinner and after dinner. I have seen the patients in the day, in one day, and every day.
Nothing happened for almost a week.
That was during the night that at once the change of her condition appeared. In the morning, when she was awake, she said, "I am cured."
A great breakthrough had been achieved. In order to persuade doctors that imipramine worked, Geigy decided to test the drug in clinical trials.
You take a large number of people who have the same illness and you divide them at random into two groups. Then you treat one group and not the other and see if the treatment makes any difference. You can make the trial more reliable by concealing from the patient whether he's getting the treatment or not. And this is called a single-blind trial. To exclude the effect of the doctor's expectations as well, he is kept in the dark about which patients are actually getting the treatment. And this is the double-blind trial. And if one group still does better than the other under these conditions, then you know that the treatment works.
In order to assess whether patients had improved, doctors needed to measure how depressed they were to start with. But there was no yardstick. Alan Broadhurst approached Professor Max Hamilton, a psychiatrist and mathematician, who was developing a scale to measure depression. In essence, the Hamilton scale was a forerunner of the do-it-yourself tests of ambition or sex appeal which fill magazines today. Hamilton took various symptoms of depression and allotted each one a score. Patients were asked if they suffered from each symptom and were awarded points accordingly. But the Hamilton scale was a hall of mirrors. It was based on the symptoms which the new drugs changed the most, such as loss of sleep or lack of appetite. Other classic aspects of depression, such as the rapport and empathy between the doctor and the patient, were ignored. And what had started off as an informal checklist has since gone on to become the gold standard for diagnosing the disease. More importantly, a process had begun whereby doctors were encouraged to abandon their own clinical judgment in favor of a standardized checklist of symptoms. With his background in traditional psychiatry, Roland Kuhn was one of many who resented this sidelining of the all-important relationship between doctor and patient.
Without this personal relation of the physician with the patient, it is not possible to really make an optimal treatment. What I have found from the patients, not from a book.
Although it is now rated as a major discovery in medicine, at the time, few people knew what to make of imipramine. When Roland Kuhn lectured at the World Psychiatric Conference, the turnout was disappointing.
My observation of the audience was that they were all interested, but not all of them fully appreciated what this man was telling us. He was telling us that something that some may have dreamt about, that someday we will have a pill that we can give to a very depressed patient, which will alleviate the suffering of that illness and perhaps completely cure it. I left there and recall telling my wife that I had just heard a very, very important breakthrough in psychiatry that perhaps could even replace the need for electroconvulsive therapy.
3 years later, Frank Aid would play a critical role in the development of the next antidepressant, this time in America. When Merck Sharp and Dohme developed a drug similar to imipramine, he suggested they test it as an antidepressant. The drug worked, but many American psychiatrists were suspicious of the pills. They still believed that depression was the product of life experience rather than brain chemistry.
Well, there were psychiatrists who were skeptical about that you could treat an illness like depression with medicines. Part of that was due to the fact that the concept of what really is depression was not very clear. There were those who would call it depression, and some next doctor to see the same patient would say it's not depression, it's something else. So I felt, as a pioneer in the antidepressant drug era, that what I should do is try to educate the prescribing physician as to what constitutes the illness.
Let's listen to a typical depressed patient during his first visit to his physician.
And I've been finding more and more that it's difficult to make even simple decisions. That is, a decision that would be simple for a well person.
And nervous and shaky and inside and out. I couldn't hardly even write. My writing looked like chicken scratching more than writing.
I think he'd go all day and wouldn't open his mouth unless I talked to him.
Unless you talk to him.
When he comes out in the morning, I'll say, well, I'm here. Can't you say good morning?
Frank Aid also faced the challenge of defining the symptoms of depression.
Well, I wrote the book, I submitted it to the publisher, and the publisher was very pleased, obviously. and he went to Merck Sharp and Dome in the United States, who were the manufacturer of a drug called amitriptyline, and they were very pleased. They bought 50,000 copies, which made this book a bestseller in psychiatry pretty promptly.
Frank Ade's book had not been written for psychiatrists, but for general physicians. Merck now bought the book in bulk and sent it all over the country.
To a certain extent, it was necessary for Merck to educate the physicians to market the illness so that they would know what they could prescribe for that illness, which was Merck's drug.
Depression reached an important crossroads. Two companies had developed almost identical antidepressants, but their ambitions for these two drugs could not have been more different. Geigy saw imipramine as an alternative to ECT, a treatment to be given in hospitals. Merck, on the other hand, saw much wider applications for their drug, and they put a huge marketing effort into moving amitriptyline out of hospitals and into doctors' surgeries. This marks a crucial turning point in the antidepressant story. Prescription was to be based not only on evidence of the drug's effectiveness, but also on a broadening concept of depression itself. Taking depression out of the hospital and into society brought it into competition with the most common nervous condition of the day, anxiety.
The assumption that you have an illness and then you find a treatment for it, often, and particularly in mental illness, you find the treatment and then you have the diagnosis. One of my colleagues, a professor in general practice, put it very well in the case of the minor tranquilizers like Valium. He thought up the epigram, "You are a case of Valium, I will give you some anxiety."
Antidepressants entered a market dominated by tranquilizers such as Valium or Librium, which subdued the symptoms of anxiety. In practice, there was a large crossover in prescription of the two groups of drugs, but while antidepressants took weeks to kick in, the tranquilizers worked immediately, and this made them the doctor's preferred choice. By the 1970s, Valium was the best-selling drug in the world.
There was a great pressure to separate anxiety and depression and make them into completely different diseases. And in fact, that has occurred, so much so that even though anxiety and depression occur extremely frequently together, they are in completely different parts of the psychiatric classification. And we, in fact, forgot the patient in looking at these conditions as though they were separate disorders.
You sort of tend to say, I'm having an off day, so you shrug your shoulders and say, I'll work it off. And gradually it gets worse and worse and worse, and you become slower and slower, and you become lethargic, you don't want to do anything. And in the finish, you are actually doing nothing, you're just sitting there, sort of stagnating.
Started when I was 17. I thought at the time that it was because I'd been overdoing things. I just felt terrifically tired and sort of weepy and miserable. And then I went to seek help. And the doctors in those days weren't really up on depression. You might be a little bit out of salts, we'll give you something for it. And I think it probably was iron medicine or something like that. I went on to amitriptyline, dithioprin, lithium, Librium. I've almost been a history of pharmacology.
One of the most profitable manufacturers of tranquilizers was the Swiss pharmaceutical company, Hoffmann La Roche. In an unfamiliar media spotlight, its chairman outlined the priorities of the fast-growing pharmaceutical industry.
The amount that you actually have to spend on research, especially considering the rate of profit that you're making, for example, on Librium and Valium, and you say you spend most of it on research, is giving you an immense amount of power over the direction in which pharmaceutical research around the world is going. It's a large sum of money. Don't you think you should be accountable for that publicly?
I would say no.
Why not?
Because it is, in my opinion, absolutely logical that my task, my responsibility is to develop hoofdmiddelaars. And why are we doing it? We are doing it because it's absolutely clear the only chance for the social security or a social health service is to make economies by finding new drugs.
But the most serious challenge to tranquilizers would come from a quite unexpected quarter. As the use of recreational drugs spread through the 1960s and 70s, governments and doctors issued dark warnings about getting hooked. The notion of addiction entered popular consciousness for the first time.
Someone calculated that in the early 1980s that by the year 2014 every single person on the planet would be on tranquilizers because the increase in prescription was so great. But of course that all came to a stop when there was the evidence that people developed dependence on them.
So we asked if you'd help us conduct a survey into tranquilizers. Firstly, let's say what we mean by tranquilizers.
Their clinical name is the...
By the early 1980s, the media began to home in on the tranquilizers, warning that long-term users could get hooked. Sales of tranquilizers began to slide.
The campaigning broadcasts felt they were doing a real public service. In fact, it did get to a level approaching hysteria.
A moral panic began. The era of tranquilizers was coming to an end. A new era of depression was about to begin. In 1980, the long-running row between the old-fashioned psychoanalysts and the new biological exponents of mental illness came to a dramatic conclusion. The Psychiatric Bureau of America, the DSM, which sets world standards for diagnosis, redefined both schizophrenia and depression. Schizophrenia, previously something of a catch-all diagnosis for mental illness, was narrowed down. Depression, on the other hand, became open-ended. Almost anyone who was unhappy for any reason could now be diagnosed as depressed. It was at this point, I believe, that psychiatrists unwittingly handed the agenda over to the pharmaceutical industry. But while the fall of the tranquilizers left a gap in the market, many patients were reluctant to turn to antidepressants, which came with their own set of alarming and unpopular side effects.
Amitriptyline is fine for people who are really depressed and who don't go to work. But they're no good for people who want to get on with their life and work. They have a very sedative effect and they make you feel... I felt as though when I got back to work again, I felt when I was on amitriptyline that I was in a daze, total daze. And it took me hours to wake up, like waking up with a hangover every morning. Till you get used to them. They gave me terrible constipation. Terrible. Then it's like you feel as though you're so tired, even though you might have had 10 hours sleep. You feel drugged, like you're on another planet.
Notions of the disease itself were beginning to change as scientists formed a new understanding of the brain's chemistry. In Sweden, Nobel Prize winner Arvid Carlsson, who discovered dopamine in the brain, now pioneered a new generation of drugs called SSRIs.
Well, the idea of the SSRIs came shortly after we had found out that the transmission of signals between nerve cells in the brain is actually chemical and not electrical, as was thought before. And so on that basis, we were able to really locate in the nerve cells the site of action of the so-called tricyclic antidepressants. So we became interested in this and got the idea that perhaps we should see what happens if we can come up with a molecule that acts only on serotonin.
The drug was called an SSRI because it selectively increased the amount of serotonin, a neurotransmitter, by blocking its reuptake between the brain cells. Because the SSRIs had a more specific action than the old tricyclic drugs, this seemed to confirm that depression was a matter of biology.
And it didn't take so much time to modify the molecule, and there it was, a compound that was actually quite selective on the uptake of serotonin. It was not a complicated work to arrive at zimelandine.
Zimelandine, made by Astra and marketed as Zelmed, was launched in 1982 with considerable success. However, within a couple of months, it was found to produce a rare and painful paralysis in a very small number of cases, so it was withdrawn from the market.
The drug was an excellent antidepressant drug. If Astra had understood what they had, they should of course have gone on. They should have said, oh, all right, this was not so good, but still we are ahead of everybody else. So to go ahead and try to come up with another molecule. So if they had been smart, they would have Prozac maybe 10 years before Lilly had it.
In 1988, Prozac hit the American market, and its success there has been legendary. Although Lilly were at first unsure how best to use the drug, it was marketed as a clean SSRI, that is, with fewer side effects than the old drugs. A veritable magic bullet.
I can cope with everyday life. I still have emotions. I still worry. I still get upset, or I get angry. I have all the emotions, but if I was faced with a crisis, I can cope with crises. I mean, I don't know whether or not this chemical imbalance will ever be cured, or, you know, whether or not I'll always be on medication. I don't know.
A silent revolution had taken place. Chemicals, which had once posed a threat, now offered a palatable explanation for nervous conditions. Patients who had once visited therapists, dreading that their problems might be linked to a deep-seated, possibly sexual complex, now learned that depression involved a deficiency of brain chemicals, which could be topped up with medication. This was a reassuring formula that doctors could offer patients. It was a formula that found its way from the pages of academic journals right through to those of Cosmopolitan. Depression had travelled from the hospital ward, through the doctor's surgery, and onto the coffee table. The almost wholesale switch from Valium to Prozac is the kind of about turn one might expect from the world of fashion, not from science or therapeutics. This success of the SSRIs illustrates another important aspect of the antidepressant story, how suddenly medical thinking can be transformed. Patients who in the 1980s were given tranquilizers in the 1990s were prescribed SSRI antidepressants. Their diagnoses changed accordingly, from anxiety to depression. So, the further expansion of depressive illness correlates directly to the marketing of the drugs.
We're in central New Jersey, which really is the pharmaceutical capital of the United States. A good 60% of the U.S. pharmaceutical companies are headquartered in New Jersey, and you have such companies as Bristol-Myers Squibb is nearby, and you have Merck's worldwide headquarters are close. The Johnson & Johnson companies are throughout New Jersey. A little further to the south in Philadelphia is GlaxoSmithKline and Wyeth Ayerst. So all sprinkled into this area are most of the nation's pharmaceutical manufacturers. That's in part why we have an office located in this area.
Marketing is big business in Drug Valley, as this part of the world is known. In the United States, antidepressants can now be advertised directly to the consumer. Designed to make you feel better, antidepressants are marketed in the best feel-good traditions of advertising. Gone are the depressed and gloomy people who filled 1970s ads. Today's adverts stress solutions, not problems.
Over 10 million people suffer from overwhelming anxiety that significantly impairs work or social life, and a chemical imbalance could be to blame. Paxil, the only medication proven effective for social anxiety disorder, works to correct this imbalance.
You're also trying to create a feel-good factor with the patient, because that, in fact, is what you're trying to accomplish clinically as well as in your marketing. Is you want the patient to feel positive. You want the patient to feel good.
Strides in the science of psychiatry have now been overtaken by strides in the science of marketing. On average, pharmaceutical companies spend twice as much on marketing as they do on research.
With correspondence mapping, you're showing the relationship of how drugs are used in different types of depressed patients. The three largest brands, you have Prozac, Zoloft, and Paxil. They have the highest degree of advertising spending, promotional spending against them. There are thousands of sales reps detailing physicians about these brands, all trying to carve out their own little niches. One of the things that the marketing has done as it relates to the depression market is it's helped to grow this market. You know, if you look at the epidemiology data, the population certainly hasn't risen and hasn't grown to the same rate that the treatment of depression has. In part, there are good drugs to treat it, but in part, there's been great marketing efforts to educate patients that they have this condition. We have data which shows which physicians prescribe more of a particular drug. Dr. Jones may get a message about how the product works in the younger patient because we know that he has more younger patients, or we know that he's a loyalist to our brand, so maybe we spend less time with him.
Pharmaceutical companies happily foot the bill for an evening out on the town. Nothing untoward about that. But one side is giving these amicable exchanges a lot more thought than the other. Come the morning after, and the pace of medical progress is such that the first morning sessions often begin at 6:30 a.m. Gifts of beads and other trivial trinkets mark the meeting between the two cultures of psychiatry and marketing. Surely this can't affect prescribing habits.
There's a set of beliefs that organize the behavior and the belief of the physician, that such that he thinks or she thinks that they're immune. It can't happen to me. And I have been trained for so many years. I've been in medical school after having gone to university, and then my training, and I've had all these courses, and I'm a scientist and a clinician. How can somebody who gives me a mug influence my behavior? There's a recent survey that surveyed medical residents, actually, and asked them how many of them thought that they were influenceable, and only 16% thought they were influenceable. But they asked how many of them thought that other physicians were influenceable. 61% said they thought other physicians were influenceable.
The pharmaceutical companies are the main source of information about new drugs. American psychiatrists usually need to earn continuing medical education credits to maintain their practice, and one of the easiest ways to do this is to attend lectures sponsored by the drug companies. The companies do most of the basic research, develop all of the new treatments, and are the main source of information about the new drugs. To prevent conflicts of interest, speakers have to disclose who has funded them and which drugs they mention. The long lists of sponsors underline who are the real paymasters.
In theory, the pharmaceutical industry should follow psychiatry, but in practice, the tail seems to be wagging the dog. Does this matter? I believe it does, because the treatments we receive for an illness condition our view of ourselves. The critics of psychoanalysis once complained that terms like neurosis and complexes had formed a psychobabble that had infected everyday language. We now have a new language of serotonin levels and mood fluctuations, a biobabble that infects our language and our thinking. This isn't progress. It's a triumph of marketing copy over serious thinking.
The first real diagnosis that I had was reactive depression, and it went on to manic depression, and finally it was by an expert, and he said it was seasonally affective disorder or winter depression.
John has been part of one of the few long-term studies of anxiety and depression. Over 18 years, the outcome of treatments by SSRIs, tricyclics, tranquilizers and other therapies was compared in patients with different diagnoses.
About 40% of them have got better, and this has really been independent of what treatment they've received. So it's not as though we've been very clever and said, well, you've got an anxious condition, we've treated you with this type of drug. You've got a depressive condition, we treated you with this one. We've in fact allocated them at random to the various forms of treatment, and in fact they've come out roughly the same. The average general practitioner actually can do pretty well without really having all this extra knowledge and all these vast numbers of drugs, and it's very impressive when the drug rep explains them to you, but in practice it doesn't make that much difference.
The drugs for depression are a kind of chemical bull in a china shop. We talk about depression being a biochemical imbalance, but we really don't know what chemicals involved, and nobody can measure it. So it's a good theory, but no one could say one way or another. I am one of those who would be more satisfied with the idea that it is a biochemical disorder if someone could tell me what the disorder was, could measure it in anyone, could alter that chemical and produce a positive beneficial effect. I suspect we're going to have to learn a more imaginative and to get a new perspective on depression before we make much more progress.
Thomas Moore has analyzed the tests that 5 of the most popular SSRIs underwent to be approved by the Food and Drug Administration. In the clinical trials, the SSRIs are rated on the Hamilton scale and compared to a placebo, an inactive compound.
If you give a patient an antidepressant drug for 6 weeks, the typical result is at the end of those 6 weeks, the patient feels better. And if we measured it by depression scores, the improvement is approximately 50%. Not a cure, not feeling I am a perfectly well-adjusted normal self, but what the literature calls a marked improvement. And that, of course, is what makes the drug so popular. The problem is, if you look at placebo-controlled trials and you compare and look at the placebo patients, the patients who were not taking an active drug, their scores too have declined, and they have declined almost as much as the people who took an active drug. The differences between those who are taking an active drug and a placebo are really very small. I think we have been incautious as a society with the enthusiasm which we have embraced these mind-altering drugs when we know so little about the underlying chemical processes.
But often it's also difficult to monitor the effects of the drugs once they are in general use. The long-running saga of the SSRIs and suicide is a case in point. Joseph Westbecker A printing press operator from Kentucky shot 20 of his workmates, killing 8 before committing suicide.
He just blasted away. He looked right straight at it. Hell, I just hit the floor out of the damn chair. Joe Westberger.
Westbecker had been taking Prozac. A year later, Dr. Martin Teicher was one of 2 Harvard psychiatrists who published an article suggesting that in a small number of patients, Prozac could induce suicidal preoccupation and violent behavior. Talk shows homed in on the issue, and it looked as though Prozac's reputation would suffer. But the Food and Drug Administration decided that no warning needed to be added to the drug's labeling. In 1994, the Westbecker case reached the courts when relatives of the victims sued Lilly for negligence in the testing and marketing of Prozac. Lilly's case was that violent behavior and suicide were caused by the disease, not by the treatment.
There is no creditable scientific evidence that Prozac causes in anyone suicidal behavior or violent behavior.
The verdict of the jury is as follows. We, the jury, do not find Eli Lilly and Company at fault.
This is a key verdict for Lilly, which had 160 cases pending against it. However, the judge, John Potter, was suspicious that a deal had been struck during the trial, since the plaintiff's lawyers had failed to bring evidence that would have been damaging to Lilly.
I wondered what their motives were. I asked them if there was any sort of settlement, and they told me there had not been.
Was a settlement offer ever made?
No.
Never?
No.
Judge Potter filed a motion to uncover what had really happened, but he encountered problems.
Both Eli Lilly's attorneys and the plaintiff's attorneys banded together to oppose any effort to uncover their agreement. Eventually, the case went to the Supreme Court of Kentucky, and they ruled that I had the authority to subpoena people and have them tell me what went on.
In 1996, it was discovered that Lilly's lawyers had secretly agreed to pay the plaintiffs a huge sum, whether they won or lost.
And after the trial, Eli Lilly put out a great deal of publicity that they had won the trial. This proved Prozac was safe, when in actuality they had been helped by the fact that the plaintiffs didn't introduce all of their evidence.
The verdict was changed to dismissed as settled.
I felt it was a tampering with the judicial system. It was making the judicial system one more arsenal in the spin doctor's, one more weapon in the spin doctor's arsenal.
Meanwhile, in Belgium, Dr. Robert Bourguignon was preparing a survey to test whether doctors there had come across any patients on Prozac with thoughts of suicide.
So we sent out roughly 800 questionnaires, and we got the number with positive answers. So the doctor had witnessed those side effects.
7 patients were reported as being anxious or as suffering from panic attacks or as having suicidal tendencies. After contacting a colleague working for Lilly about the survey, Bourguignon got a prompt reply.
The next day I came to my office not suspecting anything, and I found a great big envelope with a petition. So a bailiff had delivered that to my office the day before, and Eli Lilly was suing us for 1 million Belgian francs per questionnaire.
Bourguignon had only 2 hours to prepare his case.
I gathered some documents and I put them in a plastic bag, and I went to the Palace of Justice, which is just over there. And the judge saw us in his office.
Lilly's lawyers argued that the survey suggested the drug might have adverse side effects, and this was bad publicity for the company. They then approached doctors to deter them from taking part in the survey. Were Lilly being heavy-handed in their treatment of him?
Well, obviously, when you make $2 or $3 billion a year on one single product, you want to defend it or to protect it, so you use heavy artillery. Finally, the judge dismissed Eli Lilly's claim. Our study was published in The Lancet, so that gave it quite a credibility. There were debates in the federal parliament in Belgium.
Lilly do not accept that Prozac causes suicidal thinking. A new judgment has reopened this question with respect to two different SSRIs.
We feel elated. Justice has been done.
Donald Shell, a 60-year-old oilfield worker, was prescribed Paxil, and 2 days later he murdered his wife, daughter and granddaughter in a frenzy which ended with his own suicide. Shell's son-in-law, Tim Tobin, took out a case for wrongful death against Paxil's manufacturer, GlaxoSmithKline, and won. At the same time, a court in New South Wales posted a verdict that Zoloft, another SSRI made by Pfizer, had caused David Hawkins to strangle his wife.
We had amphetamines, we've had bromides, barbiturates, narcotics, tranquilizers, and the repeated history has been that a drug was introduced as a miracle cure with no risks, no side effects, largely because they weren't known, and then it often took 10, 20, 30 years for the serious side effects to emerge. We see sexual side effects in 60% of patients, weight gain, significant weight gains. Prozac wears off in about a third of patients within a year. And we're seeing a whole range of loss of motor control, tics, twitches, muscle spasms, tremors. And these and other side effects are showing us that the normal functioning of the brain is impaired by these antidepressants. It's almost misleading at this point in time to call them antidepressants because that implies that they're a very specific drug for a very specific condition, and they're not. They're kind of all-purpose general mood brighteners that can be applied across a broad spectrum of not only psychiatric but medical conditions. I don't think there's an epidemic of depression. I think there's an epidemic of prescribing antidepressants.
I've come to accept that it's part of me. I'm not ill, I'm just different. And I've learned to live with it quite well now. There are times when it does get hold of me, but that's all right. That is me, and I have to accept that.
Today, that area of our personal lives that lies on the dividing line between health and illness has been prized open. It has become the province of branding, marketing, and global investment. We can be persuaded that we need antidepressants in the way that we can be persuaded we need Levi jeans. We need the benefits that the pharmaceutical industry will someday bring to us in these areas, but for the moment, their capacity to sell to us far outstrips their capacity to help us. This is the point at which the antidepressants become part of the problem that is depression, rather than part of the solution.
The questions of where we have come from and where we are now are best caught perhaps in the lines of a poem by George Oppen. The steel worker on the girder learned not to look down and does his work. And there are words we have learned not to look at, not to look for substance below them. But we are on the verge of vertigo.
Nervous breakdown, 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 nervous breakdown.